series this term. In our Friday Zoom encounters, we will be analyzing crucial issues in both academia and practice in contemporary Latin America, ranging from energy transition in Brazil and South Africa, to indigenous resistance to narco rule in Mexico, and the estallido social in Chile. Today, we inaugurate our seminar series by focusing on Venezuela and some of the challenges that the country has been facing in the last decade. Just a few months ago, in September 2020, the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela affirmed that the human rights violations committed in the country amounted to crimes against humanity. This evening, we are extremely fortunate to have as our speakers José Miguel Vivanco, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch Americas Division, and our own Maryhen Jiménez, Postdoctoral Research Associate here at the Latin American Center. They will be addressing in their talks some of the challenges for Venezuela in 2021 regarding, in particular, the rule of law and human rights. José Miguel and Maryhen will speak for about 20 minutes each, and then there will be a Q&A session afterwards. You're very welcome to write down your questions in the chat throughout the presentation or ask them live afterwards during the questions and answers sessions. Just some logistical information before we start. I ask everyone to please ensure that your microphones are muted so that we avoid any unwanted noises that may interfere with the presentations. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Welcome to the Latin American Center. And Maryhen, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Francesca, for this great introduction to our seminar series. Thank you both Francesca and Andressa for inviting me to talk today. Of course, thank you to the Latin American Center, my academic home here at Oxford, where I started many years ago my research on the Venezuelan opposition. I'm very fortunate to now have my professors as my colleagues, and I'm very glad for that. Also, thank you, José Miguel, for joining us and sharing this panel with me. This is, I think, a great opportunity to give a discussion about the very tragic situation that this country is facing. So I now want to share on my screen. I hope this all works fine. So over the next 20 minutes, I want to go through, raise different points. First, I want to give, even though it's very difficult, but give a very short picture of where the country is at the moment, 2021. Then I want to very briefly introduce some of the findings of the comparative politics literature about how autocracies fall and what are the modes of transitions to democracy. And then I want to focus on the opposition's theories of change that have been deployed so far to enact political regime change in the country. I want to particularly focus on the opposition, given that this conversation is about the prospects for democratization. I think it's more useful to look at the democratic forces that can actually push forward for a change. Now, and then towards the end, I want to talk about the very big challenges ahead for the country and for its population. So here's the first big slide. I chose to start with this picture where you see lots of Venezuelans trying to enter Colombia, right? So this picture basically shows the consequence of authoritarianism today in Venezuela. People are fleeing. Over 5.4 million migrants or refugees are abroad. And as I said, they're trying to leave a country that has now very reduced opportunities, even if no opportunities, for basic living conditions. Basically, on the political front, I think it's now fair to say that there's an authoritarian consolidation in Venezuela, even though some democratic forces believe that Maduro was a weak leader. I think that he has now proven to be as Anthony Blinken put it a few days ago, a brutal dictator. So he has been actually quite successful, unfortunately, obviously for the country, but he has been successful to bypass sanctions and to sustain a cohesive authoritarian, for now, cohesive authoritarian coalition around him. As a consequence of repression and, of course, persecution, among other factors, there is now a fragmented democratic opposition and a very small, maybe for now insignificant, rise of a pseudo opposition, as Juan Lins will put it, or the rise of a systemic or loyal opposition to Maduro, who's now partly represented as well in the new, illegitimate or non-democratic National Assembly. Well, most importantly, for the population, as a consequence of authoritarianism, corruption, and José Miguel, I'm sure we'll talk about this way more than me, but I just want to mention this. Venezuela is now among the 10 worst humanitarian crises. There is above 90% poverty, almost 65% of extreme poverty, rampant inequality, an economic crisis that has been enduring, a growing illicit economy, illicit mining, human trafficking. The minimum wage is very low, as $1. Everyone knows that you cannot live on that. And because this is an academic environment, I thought bringing that academic perspective into that would also be useful. It's $5, right? So this sort of gives us a picture of the situation of the population in Venezuela. There has been a debate of whether Venezuela is a fragile state, as a gangster state, is a failed state. I wouldn't go as far as to using these terms, but I would say that it's definitely a fragile state. I wouldn't say Venezuela is yet a failed state, because we would undermine actually the size of the coercive apparatus and the capacity that the government has to repress its population. But it's important to highlight that there is an important collapse of public services. Only 1 out of 4 homes has running water every day in Venezuela. Only 1 out of 10 homes has electricity every day. And there is the presence of as well of paramilitary and irregular groups, but also Venezuelan armed gangs that control parts of the territory. So we do see now a fragmentation in terms of the territorial control over the territory in the country. So very briefly, I want to touch upon the main findings about the literature on autocratic demise. So obviously this is a very rich body of literature. I'm just trying to extract what can be useful for our conversation and discussion in the Q&A. So there are different ways that autocrats fall, or autocracies fall. There are insider-led ousters, for example, coups, or elections in which incumbents lose, and then for some reason the military make them leave. So, for example, the enforcement as well of term limits, resignations, or the creation of juntas. In the 60s and 70s, about 50% of autocrats fell through this mechanism, particularly through coups, according to Swalik. But later on, it's actually only 7% of autocrats that were deposed through coups, according to Kennel and Friends. Then there's this other way of authoritarian demise, which is through outsider-led ousters. So this means through mass revolt or revolutions. This has actually become more important over time as a mechanism of toppling authoritarian regimes. While in the 60s and 70s, fewer than 5% of ousters happened through the revolt, now, and just to give you an example, only between 2010 and 2012, a quarter of all dictators who fell through revolts. Of course, there's another cause, which is the death of an autocrat, which can also lead to the demise of an authoritarian regime. Now, as many of us know, and it's it's the empirical reality out there. Authoritarian demise does not necessarily mean democratic transition to democracy. And this is particularly important because in the Venezuelan case, there's part of the leadership that believes that getting rid of Chavez back then, or getting rid of Maduro, no matter how, this is something that comes up a lot in my own research. So there isn't much thinking about what type of transition can actually guarantee or guarantee not, but facilitate an effective democratization process. So the way that autocrats exit will tell us a lot about the prospects for democratization. That's actually also another big finding in the literature. When an autocrat is deposed through revolt, in 85% of the cases, a new type of regime emerges. In contrast, when leaders are ousted through coups, the same regime persists in about 50% of the cases. And when an autocrat loses power via regular means, for example, resignation, enforcement of term limits, a leader within the authoritarian ruling coalition replaces the autocrat, and the regime persists in about 58% of cases. So this then leads me to talk a little bit about the modes or types of transitions. There can be different types, and we know this as well, from a general knowledge about politics. There can be pacted or negotiated transition, often facilitated by the international community. We already know from classical work on democratization by O'Donnell and Schmitter, then sometimes when there is schisms, so moderates within the regime try to negotiate with moderates within the opposition, and so a democratization process is pushed forward, or through revolution, as I just said. So what's the mechanism here? Basically, through mass mobilization, defections can occur within the military, or the military decides to stop supporting the autocrat. Let's think of, as example, some of the cases in the Arab Spring. Another one is the foreign intervention. So foreign states or international alliances intervene in the country to impose democracy in an ideal case, but as we also know, that's not always the case. And then there's rich literature on the democratization by elections. The results here are quite mixed. So some have found that holding repeated elections, even in non-democracies, some of the democratic qualities can actually improve. How, you might ask? Well, the opposition can improve its organizational and campaign capacity by participating in elections. Citizens can also come to expect, to participate and take action in political life. And civil society organizations can learn how to better advocate nationally and internationally about what is going on, can better communicate what's going on in a country. So even though, and this is particularly important for some factions in the opposition in Venezuela who believe that there can be no kind of change so long Maduro is in power. But there's evidence, as I said, in other contexts and regions where some democratic behavior can even can be learned and can be exercised, for example, deliberation or participation in non-democracies. Now, this is not always the case. Other lines of research, for example, the work of Alan Lust on the Middle East, shows that elections can provide a mechanism for the distribution of patronage. So it reduces the demands of change. Basically, political elite can participate in elections to receive privileges and spoils. So obviously, they will not be interested in a regime change so long that they can receive these spoils. So with that framework in mind, I want to now really come to the Venezuelan case. And so far, the modes or the mechanisms that the opposition has tried to employ to seek regime change. As you can see, there's some of the mechanisms that I mentioned earlier. So the opposition has tried through mass mobilization to topple Chavez and also Maduro. For example, the mass mobilization in 2002, but also La Salida in 2014, and protests, mass protests in 2017, all of which were met with government repression as expected. It has also embarked on a strategy that has also not been proven yet to be very successful, generally speaking, which is the boycott. It has boycotted legislative elections. Also, well, when I say boycotted, I'm talking here about larger parts of the opposition. That has always been some part of the opposition that has decided to participate, but that participation has not been very meaningful. So in 2017, it did not participate in the regional elections, and in 2018, it didn't participate in the presidential elections, and in 2020, it also decided to boycott the legislative elections. And this is quite interesting, and I think more research should be done on this, because there are two reasons why oppositions don't participate according to the existing research on this. One is that they know that they cannot win, and so they don't want to expose their weaknesses in a non-democratic system. And two, they believe that by threatening and effectively not participating, that they will get some sort of leverage to then negotiate better electoral conditions in the future. That hasn't happened yet in Venezuela. I believe actually that the boycotts have hurt the Venezuelan opposition, because it doesn't really represent a meaningful space for mobilization or achievement of political muscle, let's put it in that way. It has also participated in elections, right? So it participated in elections in earlier as well, but I'm saying 2012, 13, and 15, because it was in those years that basically political change was a possibility. I think that it's very clear that in 2006, Hugo Chavez was popular enough so that it was really almost impossible to win an election in 2006. It has also participated in referenda in 2004, which it lost. And in 2016, it tried to enact a recall referendum, but this opportunity was shut down by the government and state institutions. Now, the opposition has also participated in dialogue attempts and or negotiations, both in Venezuela and abroad. For example, accompanied by the Catholic Church, the Vatican, or in the Dominican Republic and Barbados and Oslo. And now, since 2019, there's a new mechanism, which is called the interim presidency, led by Juan Guaidó, which resides on an interpretation of the Constitution, where it says that the Speaker of the National Assembly assumes the presidency, interim presidency, and calls for new elections in the case of a vacancy in the presidency. So the argument goes, because there weren't legitimate elections in 2018 in Venezuela, there's a vacancy in the presidency, and so the Speaker of the National Assembly, which by chance happened to be Juan Guaidó, because it was the turn of Voluntad Popular to lead the opposition-led National Assembly, to assume the interim presidency. Well, last year in December, the legitimacy of the National Assembly finished, but the interim presidency goes on at least for another year. Now, another mechanism that has been used and has been the favorite, let's say, or prioritized mechanism by some factions of the opposition is the international pressure. So there's this thinking that through very harsh international pressure, either economic or diplomatic, the regime will collapse. So particularly under Trump's leadership, Venezuela or Maduro's government had been facing harsh international economic and diplomatic pressure. However, that has not yet translated into a regime collapse. So I tried to make a slide where all of this could be visible at once. I realize this is quite small, but what I try to do is sort of put in colors to different strategies, and you can see over time. So mass mobilization is in orange, red is the boycott, and green is participation, and then in blue is the interim government. What I wanted to show here is that the opposition has actually participated in elections quite a bit. But that's not the only question I believe that matters. I think that the crucial question is how they participated and whether they were coordinated and whether they were prepared to take on an election in a growing authoritarian regime. My own research shows that actually coordination, and in line with other research, coordination among opposition actors is very crucial. But as you probably know from the news, and over the last couple of years, and of course, as a consequence of repression, persecution, the opposition has been quite fragmented. But the point is here, can the ambitions for leadership cease in a way within the opposition so that they can come around and coordinate now maybe with other social actors, given that repression is much higher than it was a few years back? I believe that if there is no context or no, let's say, inter-opposition negotiation first to strengthen the democratic leadership and build a stronger alliance, it will be very difficult to face a negotiation or seek any type of regime change. So I think, and I should be still in time, but I now want to very briefly discuss the challenge that I see ahead, and I obviously cannot cover all of them. Maybe we can talk about some of these points in the Q&A afterwards. Well, first of all, there's this thinking that through international sanctions, a regime will collapse. Well, there is actually evidence that that's not always the case. I think Iran is there, Cuba is there, and now also the case of Venezuela, though this is obviously a very recent case. So this thinking that you can have sanctions that have an effect. I mean, this debate in Venezuela is still going on, but that you can have an asphyxiated, sort of isolated society, that kind of society can mobilize against autocracy is, for me, very counterintuitive. And I say this because particularly the humanitarian assistance will need to be increased. So international efforts should be increasing towards alleviating the situation of the Venezuelan population who is suffering. And this also counts for the COVID vaccine. So U.S. foreign policy, I think that some of the strategies maybe have to be reshaped or rethought. I don't think that it was a very constructive foreign policy that the U.S. employed under Trump's leadership. I think that it polarized internationally the case of Venezuela even more. Now Venezuela is a domestic electoral issue. So I am not just thinking about, whether, sanctions are being employed or not. I think that that's a debate in its own right. I think that smart sanctions would be more useful, but I also think that the rhetoric should change. And I think that the US can actually shape the incentives for negotiations, which I believe would increase the chances of a successful democratization at some point. I don't see it in the short term. And then this connects with the domestic strategy. The question is, how long can be an interim government be in place that is not really on the streets with the population, that cannot really deliver, and that lacks accountability and transparency? I understand, of course, the political reasons for why some politicians want to hold on to this mechanism, but the question is, can it really promote democratization in Venezuela? What do other cases of interim governments tell us, for example, Syria or Libya? And then, so what are the opportunities then? Well, there are upcoming local and regional elections. And the question is, can the international community and domestic forces try to negotiate a new electoral council to maybe participate and, in the context of an election, organize and mobilize the population to participate in its own political future? Additionally, I think it's important, there's some small, yet small attempts to build a grassroots movement, a non-violent resistant grassroots movement, which is very crucial. The work of Chenoweth and Stepan show that non-violent resistance is actually more successful than that violent one. And then if you had those two things going on, you could see eventually maybe some sort of a coordination among partisan and non-partisan actors that can promote an environment in which a negotiation can take place. And I want to really finally end with the two latter points. Maybe there's a need for a new and more inclusive narrative and future perspectives, and this is going to be a very interesting debate also with Jose Miguel. Of course, I'm not trying here to say that there needs to be impunity. There needs to be justice. There needs to be reconciliation for the human rights abuses and alleged crimes against humanity that have been occurring in Venezuela. At the same time, research shows that reducing the levels of violence is very important to enact democratization, and violence will rise, or military officers or part of the coercive apparatus will engage in violence under two circumstances. One, when they don't have an expectation about the future, and two, if they expect to be killed, imprisoned. So they will have little incentives to not repress a population in the potential phase of a mobilization. So it's important also to understand the capacity of the coercive state apparatus to not undermine the violence that can be produced through the state. And this is a very important point, particularly for the military sectors. As we know, they're very important in Venezuela. And even though this might sound odd, but thinking about giving them an institutional exit, of course, not for the perpetrators, but I'm thinking here of, paths of career advancement, recruitment, or promotion where it's based on performance. So if there is no life, if there's no perspective, and research shows that if there's no perspective about the future, there are no incentives to promote or at least not impede the democratization. So that's something that needs to be thought about. And then finally, the identity. What makes Venezuelans today? How can the diaspora connect with the people inside? What are the motivations for collective action and mobilization? I do think that that's an issue that matters and that can give hope to a population that, as I said in the beginning, is suffering from so many different angles. So I leave it there. Thank you so much. I will now stop sharing my screen. I will pass on to Jose Miguel.
Jose Miguel, I think you need to unmute your microphone. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for having me in this very, very important meeting. Thank you, Francesca, for chairing this event, and obviously thank you, Maryhen, for your very comprehensive, smart, and accurate description of what is going on in Venezuela, and also for the analytical points that you raise with regard to the multiple or different options and perspectives, alternatives that in similar cases has been explored and implemented to ensure a transition to democracy. I'm going to be focusing my remarks mostly on the record of the current government in Venezuela, and I'm sure that we will have plenty of opportunity to discuss not only the record of the dictatorship in Venezuela, but also the multiple or different options that we might be facing today to make a transition from this from the current conditions in Venezuela to something that might hopefully improve conditions for the vast majority of Venezuelans who are suffering as victims of this of a regime that is engaging in massive and systematic human rights atrocities. I'm going to start my remarks by highlighting the 4 points of the hearing of Antony Blinken, the next Secretary of State of the Biden administration. Maryhen already referred to one of those 4 points, which I think are very solid, very, very important to keep in mind. Antony Blinken has not been confirmed yet by the Senate. Hopefully, he should be confirmed soon. And but the points that he raised with regard to Venezuela, I think, are very, very useful to keep in mind. Number one, we are dealing with a brutal dictator, and he bluntly characterized Maduro as a brutal dictator. I fully agree with that one, and I think it's at this stage there is pretty much consensus that he is a dictator and that his regime has committed very, very serious atrocities. The second point, which is pretty obvious and is related to Maryhen intervention, is that Blinken said, you know, all the international efforts that we have tried so far has failed to achieve the objective. I think it's a quite fair point. The next one is that he's suggesting that better international multilateral coordination is needed to produce change in Venezuela. And the last one is about the humanitarian emergency that Venezuela is suffering, and he's committed to promote more assistance, more aid to alleviate the humanitarian crisis where most Venezuelans are suffering shortages of food and medicine in the middle of the pandemic. Now, let me go back to the main point of my 15 minutes presentation. Is related to a new report, a relatively new report issued a month ago by the special prosecutor, the Office of the Special Prosecutor of the ICC, indicating that the office examination of the case of Venezuela is establishing that possible crimes against humanity has been committed in Venezuela. And the chief prosecutor is signaling clearly that she is willing to move forward with the case of Venezuela, and that the government is responsible for those crimes against humanity. More in detail, the report issued on December 14th, covering situation of Venezuela. The chief prosecutor is announcing that probably soon the case of Venezuela will be of a full knowledge or examination of the ICC, not just the it will move from the status of preliminary investigation to the next one, the next phase. The Office of the Prosecutor concluded that it's reasonable to believe that crimes against humanity have been committed in Venezuela, and specifically the prosecutor found that there is and I'm quoting, reasonable basis to believe that since at least April 2017, civilian authorities, members of the armed forces, and pro-government individuals have committed crimes against humanity of imprisonment and other severe deprivation of physical liberty, torture, rape, or other forms of sexual violence. I continue quoting verbatim the report, and persecution against any identifiable group or collectivity on political grounds. There has been, now I'm going back to my language. This is not now quoting from the chief prosecutor. There has been no justice in Venezuela for the victims of extrajudicial killings, arbitrary arrest, and torture by security forces with the knowledge or acquiescence of Venezuelan high-level political, military, and judicial authorities. Human Rights Watch have been able to document more than 15,000 arbitrary arrests since 2014, more than 19,000 killings in alleged, quote, resistance to authority cases since 2016, many of which were extrajudicial executions. Many cases of brutal torture has been documented as well by our reports since that date, including electroshocks, sexual abuse, waterboarding. More than 800 cases of civilians tried by military courts. Recently, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, documented specific techniques of torture used by the security forces of Venezuela, which are not different from the techniques used by right-wing military dictators in Latin America in the 80s, in the 70s, and referring to electric shocks on the eyelids of the victims. Electric shocks, and I'm quoting Michelle Bachelet's report, recent report on torture in Venezuela, to the genitals of the victims. Now, the prosecutor's report noted that the office focused on allegations related to the treatment of persons in detention, for which a sufficiently detailed and reliable information was available to the court, but without prejudice to other crimes that it might determine at a later stage. I'm quoting verbatim. The annual report indicates that there is information implicating the Bolivarian National Police, the Bolivarian National Intelligence Services, the Director General of Military Counterintelligence, the Special Action Forces, the police, the Bolivarian National Guard, the National Anti-Extortion and Kidnapping Command, and certain units of the Bolivarian National Armed Forces. It also states that available information indicates that pro-government individuals have participated in the repression of actual or perceived government opponents with participation or acquiescence of security forces. The prosecutor's office anticipates concluding the preliminary examination during the first half of 2021. In other words, by probably June, the latest, we might have a final report from that office on Venezuela to determine whether there is a reasonable basis to proceed with a full investigation. The office will determine whether the crimes within the court jurisdiction that has been identified are sufficiently grave to merit the court's attention. It will also determine whether national authorities are carrying out credible investigation and, if appropriate, prosecuting cases that would otherwise be subject to the ICC jurisdiction. Since former President Hugo Chavez and his supporters in the National Assembly carried out a political takeover of the Venezuelan Supreme Court in 2004, the judiciary of Venezuela has stopped functioning as an independent branch of government. The Supreme Court justices have openly rejected in several rulings, the principle of separation of powers, and have consistently upheld abusive policies and practices. Human Rights Watch research has shown that the judiciary has failed to adequately investigate compelling evidence of widespread abuses, and impunity for human rights abuses remains the norm in Venezuela. The ICC prosecutors opened a preliminary examination into possible crimes in Venezuela in February of 2018. Venezuela is an ICC member. Under the ICC founding Rome Statute, the ICC is charged with acting as a court of last resort to investigate serious international crimes, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. On September 26, 2018, 6 ICC members countries asked the court's prosecutor to investigate potential crimes in Venezuela, an unprecedented move. The Maduro government also referred other crimes to the ICC prosecutor in February of 2020, allegedly caused by unilateral sanctions imposed on Venezuela, leading to the opening of a second separate preliminary examination by the Office of the Prosecutor. In several reports that we have released between 2014 and 2017, and that we have shared directly with the Office of the Prosecutor, the Chief Prosecutor of the ICC, we found evidence of widespread abuses during the crackdowns in Venezuela. Security forces personnel beat detainees and severely tortured them. Security forces also used disproportionate force and carry out violent abuses against people in the streets, and arbitrarily arrested and prosecuted government opponents. The nature and timing of many of the abuses, as well as the frequent use of political epithets by the abusers, suggest that their aim was not to enforce the law or disperse protests, but rather to punish people for their perceived political views. Similarly, in early July 2020 report, which covered the human rights situation in Venezuela from June 2019 to May 2020, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, documented cases of severe beatings by boards, suffocation with plastic bags and chemicals to the detainees, waterboarding, electric shocks, exposure to cold temperatures, and constant electric light, being handcuffed for extended periods of times, and death threats. Human Rights Watch research shows that the abuses were not isolated. This is a very important point. They were not isolated cases or the result of excesses by rogue security forces members. On the contrary, the fact that widespread violations were carried out repeatedly by multiple security forces during a determined time frame and in numerous locations with a similar pattern of abuses, supports the conclusion that the abuses have been part of a systematic practice by Venezuelan security forces. Human Rights Watch also documented cases in which victims were subject to enforced disappearances for periods of days, of several weeks. Police and security forces have killed nearly 18, at this stage is 19,000 people in Venezuela, in instances of alleged, quote, resistance to authority, end of a quote, between 2016 and 2019. Nobody has yet compiled detailed information as to how many of these killings by security forces have been extrajudicial executions. But the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has concluded that, quote, many of these killings may constitute extrajudicial executions, end of a quote. In 6 cases, the Office of Michelle Bachelet documented those killings where government opponents or people perceived as such. Agents executed them during raids after anti-government protest. Finally, on September of last year, the United Nations Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Venezuela presented its report to the UN Human Rights Council, concluding that Venezuelan authorities and colectivos, armed pro-government groups, committed egregious violations amounting to crimes against humanity. The independent expert leading the mission say they had reasonable grounds to state that, quote, most of the violations and crimes were part of a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population. The experts found that high-level authorities, and they mentioned by name Maduro, as well as several Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior, had high-level authorities had knowledge, I'm quoting, of and contribute to the commission of these crimes, and that commanders and superiors knew or should have known about them and did not take measures to prevent or to investigate and sanction these crimes. I think this is a fair and recent description of what are the horrible, deplorable human rights conditions that the Venezuelans are suffering as a result of the repressive policies and practices that are promoted, adopted, and implemented by the current dictatorship of Venezuela. And the good news is that all the mechanisms of United Nations are acting consistently together with full cooperation to address this unique environment of gross violations of human rights committed with full impunity. Whatever transition is eventually discussed about Venezuela, it has to take into account the massive and systematic atrocities committed by that government. And justice needs to be ensured for the large number of victims who are still suffering the abuses committed by that government. I fully understand that to accomplish these goals is not easy. It's a big challenge, but the role of the international community, as well as the international mechanisms established precisely to deal with this type of cases, like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is to press for justice locally. If justice is not able to be achieved at local level. The last resort is the office of the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, to call for a full investigation into these massive and systematic human rights violations committed by the government and state actors in Venezuela. Thank you very much. And I'm more than happy to participate in now a Q&A phase of this meeting.
Thank you so much, Maryhen and José Miguel, for your insightful presentations. We are very fortunate to have two experts like you share their thoughts about these very complex questions. We are now going to move on to the Q&A session for about 35 minutes, and we have already several questions in the chat.